In this video, we're going to talk about controlling and closing out the project. One of the first steps of this, or one of the first things that we want to consider when we're talking about controlling a project, is keeping track of the information. So project information and tracking. It's important to track that information as it's going to give you things like your costs and your schedule variance. It's also going to keep you aware of who's responsible for certain things. It's going to keep your risk register updated and these types of things. When you're looking at project management software, there are a variety of options available. What you're going to find is that if you're in a large organization, or if you're in an organization that already does quite a few projects, they likely already have project management information software. So you can probably use some of that existing software. Software such as Microsoft Projects, Teamworks is another software. But what you'll find is that for a variety of different industries, there'll be a variety of different project management software. If your organization that you're part of doesn't necessarily have its own project management software and you don't undertake a lot of projects, what you'll also find is that for these types of projects, managing implementation of automation in supply chain, you could probably get away with using a workbook, Excel spreadsheets, those types of things in order to manage the project. And throughout this, I've been able to send you different templates that'll help you with that. So it's up to you in terms of what you're going to use to manage the project. If you've got project management software that you've used before, that your organization uses, that's helpful. Otherwise, spreadsheets probably are sufficient, so long as you're not getting into multi-million-dollar projects over several years. One thing to note with software though, is that software can't fix bad process, and it can't fix bad data as well. So make sure that your data is decent, is relatively clean that you're using, and that your processes are still sound. Before you start looking at automation as a whole, you should be looking at these types of things, making sure your processes are sound and your data is sound as well. But as it relates to managing projects, thinking that software is going to fix bad processes, that's never the case. Can you overdo the tracking? Yeah, you can. And I mean, it comes down to what benefit do you get from tracking the information? And what's that doing? I mean, if you're dealing with a small project, you don't need to necessarily track every minute detail. If you're dealing with a project that's only going to last a month or two, you may not even give regular status updates. You might not look too much at time-phased budgets. You might simply say, well, we're about half done and we look like we're on budget. It depends on the size and the relative nature of the project to your organization. At the end of the day, try to keep things as simple as possible. The KISS principle applies here, and you'll get a lot of benefit from keeping things simple. Throughout any project, potential problems are going to come up. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the key or the most common potential problems here. Poorly defined goals or really poorly defined scope is probably the biggest problem that I see come up. The scope creep. So things start to stretch. You start to add different things to a project. You start to subtract. Oftentimes you don't subtract from a project, but you add more to a project and you end up with a never-ending perpetual project. Take, for example, software implementation. You have the opportunity to bring in 10 modules overall, but you decide that you're going to implement 6 of the modules to begin with. Partway through the project, you start to see, wow, geez, module 7 would be useful to have, so let's implement module 7. Then partway through the project some more, you think that module 8 would be useful to have. So you start to expand the scope. The problem with that, though, is that you end up never ending that project, and you keep adding additional resources and so forth. A better way of handling that type of thing would be to complete the first 6 modules and then set up a new project for additional modules. A better scenario yet is that you adequately define the scope and you took additional time to help define the problem in the project to begin with, and perhaps you realize that the 8 modules would have been a better project in the first place. So I can't stress enough how much or how important it is to spend that additional time to begin with to adequately define really what you want to accomplish, and to work with your vendors to make sure that that is going to accomplish what you're looking for. So in addition to scope creep and scope issues, you have team-related issues, and there's probably 2 potential issues here that you want to look at. Number 1 is conflict, and you have dysfunctional and functional conflict. Functional conflict is fine. People, I mean, that's where creativity will come from, and so forth. Dysfunctional conflict is where you can start to have some issues, and you really want to get an end to dysfunctional conflict as soon as you possibly can, to the extent that even if it means removing a team member on this particular project or whatnot, if that's what you have to do, you really need to get rid of that dysfunctional conflict. The other thing that you're going to run into with team-related issues is this idea of groupthink. You have a well-oiled machine that's working together as a group, but you have 1 or 2 dominant people on that group, and as soon as they say something, a lot of times the others will fall behind and continue down that path. Groupthink is problematic because you may not get the best scenario or the best information out of the group if they're operating effectively as just one person in the group. You may want to consider doing things like at meetings, having people write their ideas down and then speaking to them, or the chair of that meeting to speak to those ideas. You may also want to intentionally appoint yourself as a devil's advocate that will challenge ideas. Having open brainstorming sessions where just ideas alone with no critique are put down on the board before discussing anything further. Those are all ways that you can help deal with groupthink, but groupthink is something you want to try to avoid. So between the scope and the people-related issues or team-related issues, I've talked a bit also about stakeholder engagement and maintaining that, and maybe having to adjust how you're going to communicate with those stakeholders. That's often another issue that you may come up with in project management. If you're a project manager and you have a CEO, so you'll have to report to the CEO, but you're also managing your team, you'll find yourself often managing up and down. And so that stakeholder engagement and how you manage stakeholders is something you want to really keep on top of well. Finally, kind of the last part of potential problems that come up is poor risk planning. And poor risk planning can go in 2 different ways. One, I've seen a lot of organizations write down every possible risk, and they set up the risk register that might be 20, 30 pages long. Well, by the time you have that risk register, nobody's looking at it because it's too long. It's too much information. They've created too much noise. So find the right number of risks that will still actually be looked at and reviewed, but also really are the more pertinent risks. Finally, a realistic note about problems in project management of any sort. They're going to come up. They always will. They always do. And really, when you're managing a project, a lot of the task is simply to manage these problems that come up. And at the end of the day, my best advice is have fun dealing with the challenges that are going to come up and that you're going to deal with, and move on once they're dealt with. So you've now dealt with the different problems that have come up, you've tracked your project and so forth, you've controlled your project. Now you're getting down to project closure. Let's talk a little bit about the 3 different types of projects that you might have. Number 1 is a never-ending project or a perpetual project. Oftentimes this is because of scope creep, and I've talked a fair amount about ways that you can reduce scope creep in projects, and really it comes down to partly identifying adequate scope or spending adequate time on identifying scope to begin with, but also just being very rigid in terms of allowing scope creep happening, as in don't allow it to happen. The second type of closure you can have is incomplete projects. And this is typically something has dramatically or structurally changed in the organization or in the environment that has meant that this product is no longer, or this project is no longer viable or no longer useful. New product development, often this will happen In these types of scenarios of automating a supply chain, perhaps it's bringing in software, but by the time you have the software partway implemented, there's better software out there. So again, spending more time on the planning and really making sure that you've covered your basis on the planning can help prevent some of these issues. Some of these incomplete projects are unpreventable and are just going to happen from time to time. Finally, and what we really hope for, are complete projects, and ideally complete on time and on budget. These projects are really what we're going for. Within all these projects, though, once they are complete or they've been labeled as a failure or an incomplete project, we want to conduct some level of project audit on it. And a project audit is not a way to find blame on what went wrong. You go through a project and you look at what went right, what went wrong, and you find causes. You use things like fishbone diagrams and so forth, but you try to really find causes of what went well, what went wrong on these projects. Similar to that, you want to gather your lessons learned from projects. I have done a lot of different implementations, typically of companies, and it took me longer than it should have to realize that I should be recording lessons learned, and for that matter, gathering documents that I created for particular implementations, because those checklists and those documents could have been useful for other projects. And that's all parts of things that you'll do within a project audit, and the lessons learned is it's gathering what you've gained from that project, whether or not it was successful or not, reflecting on it and bettering your organization for the future because of how that project went. Okay, so a lot of information has been covered over these last 3 videos, or this session on project management. Some of the key points, and you've heard me say it a few times, is really do your due diligence in the planning, really outline that scope of the project, of the problem you're trying to solve, as that's going to help prevent things like the perpetual never-ending project. Putting time into your business case is also going to yield you good benefits as well. That's another area that you really want to spend some time and effort on. Finally, gaining what you've learned from the project so that the next time you implement something, the next time you take on another similar kind of project, getting those lessons learned and doing that project audit will go a long way for the future success of projects within your organization, even if it's not an organization that has lots of projects ongoing. So those are some of the key points that you want to keep in mind. Now, next session, I'm going to cover off some of the basics or the fundamentals of supply chain management, and within that we'll talk about evaluating where your supply chain currently is at, looking at how you currently compete, and helping you define what area you might want to look at automating.